Welcome to this week's Who the Folk podcast. I'm Lonnie Goldsmith, the editor of TC Jewfolk. This week I talked to Sho Garland, the new executive director of Talmud Torah of St. Paul. We talk about what brought them back to the Twin Cities, what it's like running the school they're a graduate of, and what's on tap for the next school year on this week's Who the Folk podcast. Sho Garland, welcome to the Who the Folk podcast. Thank you for joining me.
I'm so glad to be here. Thank you for having me.
Of course. You are the new-ish executive director at Talmud Torah of St. Paul.
Yeah, so what I always tell people is that I am either very new or very old, depending on how you define the question.
Fair enough.
Because I've been on staff here since mid-August, so I guess it's 3 months and a couple of days.
Okay.
But since I was a student at this school for more than 10, 11 years, I've been around the institution a fair bit. Let's put it that way.
So coming to St. Paul, taking this job as a homecoming of sorts, then.
Yeah, most certainly. It was, the way I described it when I was interviewing, and now is it's really beshert. There's really no other way to describe it.
Okay.
I spent the last 8 years before this living in Boston, Massachusetts, where I was living to go to. Originally, I moved out there with my wife to go to grad school at the Heller School for Social Policy and Management at Brandeis. And then I worked out there for a few years, and we'd always considered whether we wanted to move back. And COVID made it the right time for a multitude of reasons. And we'd actually decided to move back before the job became available, but then the job became available within about a week when we made the decision. And it was just sort of like this perfect serendipitous kismet beshert set of timing, and now I'm here.
That is definitely a fortuitous, I guess, just the way the timing worked out. Like, that
Yeah,
doesn't usually.
We were here. So I was here in the spring because my mother had an injury, and I was here to help her do post-injury caregiving, and also it coincided with Pesach, which we were going to be here for anyway, because during COVID, at least pre-vaccines, if you were going somewhere, we were driving, and we were driving, and when you're driving 1,300 miles, it's a commitment. You want to be there for a chunk of time.
Yes.
So we were here for 5 months, or excuse me, rather 5 weeks in the spring. And that was when we decided to make like the firm plan to set out when we were going to move back and how we were going to move back. And I think it was like 2 days before I left in mid-April that when somebody reached out and said, "Hey, this opportunity is available, and I thought it might be up your alley," and then the rest is history.
You don't hear many people say that COVID presented a good opportunity to move halfway across the country.
Yeah, you don't. Although I will say that for my part, I think we could probably all say this, but I just continuously say that I'm really grateful for like the what COVID has allowed me to do in terms of like sort of examining whether I was doing what I really wanted to be doing, and whether I was as close to the people as I wanted to be close to, and whatnot. And certainly I will say the first like year of the pandemic was incredibly challenging for me, because I mean, I worked from home from the middle of March until I left my previous job at the end of June. And actually, over the course of the pandemic, I was in Minnesota for a total of 3 months over the first year of the pandemic.
Wow. I guess, how does this job and this opportunity at Talmud Torah St. Paul fit with what you were hoping to do career-wise, maybe in a way that your previous opportunity in Boston didn't
so much? Great question. So, I mean, I will say, so at my previous position, I was working in fundraising for an organization that provides affordable housing to older adults on presently 5 campuses in the greater Boston area. And it was really gratifying work. I was really happy to be there, and I learned a lot about fundraising, but I was ready to kind of move on and find my next step anyway. And I took a fairly circuitous path to get to a career in fundraising, or that touches fundraising broadly, because I originally went to grad school so I grew up here. and I went to Beloit College for undergrad. And after undergrad, I'm 33. I graduated on 2010 from undergrad into, I think, what is like pretty much universally recognized as, at least pre-COVID, maybe the worst job market for college graduates in since the Depression.
Yeah, that's about
Um,
right.
that sounds about right. Yeah,
That sounds about
and
right. Yeah.
and so when I did finally get a job that like required a college degree, I spent most of my off time working on the then potential state constitutional amendment to ban same gender marriage in the Minnesota state constitution, which was it was at the hardcore center of my life because that was before I transitioned. And so at the time I was still someone who presented as a woman in the world, and was engaged to another person who still presents as a woman in the world, a cisgender woman. Um, and and so I spent a lot of my off time doing that, and I found that it really energized and motivated me, and I wanted to go and approach doing some sort of a career that approached public affairs or public policy or politics in some way. And so I went to Brandeis originally for a master's degree in public policy, and discovered that I loved policy and how analytical it was, but it can be incredibly theoretical. And so I wanted to work on something more applied. And so then I ended up adding on a second degree in nonprofit management, and that brought me to working at several different institutions that are nonprofits. And I've worked at two different organizations that put the queer community at the center of their mission, including Keshet in Boston, that works
Oh,
for the
sure.
that works for the equality and inclusion of LGBTQ Jews and Jewish life. And so I did community programming for them in Boston for a year, and then I shifted into fundraising in 2019 at Two Life, where I was most recently, and now I am here. And so I say that I took a circuitous path to get here, but the truth is, being an executive director, you have to have a little bit of knowledge of everything. And so having taken a circuitous path to get here kind of makes me a really well-rounded candidate to be in the job.
Right. Like, you don't necessarily have to have taught to be the executive director of a school, because your job, you need to make sure you have talented teachers in the classroom to be able to do that.
Right.
So there's a bit of HR in a way, in terms of hiring qualified people and knowing what qualified people look like for that particular role, but you don't necessarily have to have that expertise to be able to make that work.
Agreed. And so I started in the probably the worst time to start for a school, all things considered, because it was about I think I started 2 weeks to the day before our first day of school this school year. At least our first day of school for the day school, I should say, because the Chagim were so early this year that we didn't
Yep.
even start our afternoon school in Midrashah until October. But that was probably the worst time you could have picked, unfortunately, to start a brand new job, just because it's
Yep.
so close to the beginning of the school year. But for my part, all of our teachers were already in place, and we have such an incredibly talented educational staff here that I had no question about sort of like what it. We didn't even have to look at the prospect of hiring talented teachers, if you were, when I started, because they were already in place.
Oh, that's good.
Yeah.
That's fortunate. So, how much has the school, and I guess sort of even the idea of a Talmud Torah of St. Paul, changed from your time as a student to now?
Oh, how much time do you have? I mean, it. In some ways, it's changed, and in some ways, it's still totally the same.
Hmm.
We were a larger school in terms of student body when I was a student. I was a student here from 91 to 2002, including the years I spent in TCJMS, the Twin Cities Jewish Middle School.
Okay.
Um, and so when obviously things look bigger when you're things look different rather when you're a bigger student body, but our commitment to having a strong both Jewish curriculum and a really robust general educational curriculum is the same. Um, on the day school side, on the afternoon school side, our commitment to being able to serve students for whom day school isn't right is absolutely still the same. And actually, even before, even before COVID, the school was already talking about entertaining some like virtual options, and COVID forced us into that. Our afternoon school in Midrashah are totally remote this year, and as a result, we actually have students joining us who, if we were in person, they would never be able to join us. They'd never be able to learn with us in person. So we have students in the metro area that are coming to us from Minnetonka and Plymouth and even just straight across the river in Minneapolis. We have students joining us from across the St. Croix River in Wisconsin, and we even have some students this year joining us from the coasts in a couple of different places.
Which is really pretty phenomenal to see how you embraced the idea of virtual schooling, which, having two school-age kids, it's not great. I mean, it's not a great situation to be in. Obviously, nobody wants it to be this way, but it does expand the opportunities for people to learn about you and get an education through you.
It does. And one thing that I'll say on that front is that the the education that I got here as a student, 20 some odd years ago was stellar and top notch, and there's no question of that. And one of the things that's sort of like an incredible blessing, I think, to our community and certainly to me personally, is there are teachers here who were my teachers that are still teachers here in the community. Rabbi Yessi Gordon is still a teacher in our Midrashah, and Sarah Lynn Newberger is our director of Hineni, our adult learning and contemplative practices arm, which is not even a thing that we had when I was a student. And I'm so glad that we're really able to sort of truly embody what lifelong learning looks like, because we're not just talking about school age children anymore. We've got people who join us for Hineni courses from across the country and across the age spectrum.
Every once in a while we keep talking about, okay, maybe things, maybe the pandemic's ending, maybe things are getting better, and then clearly at the moment that we're speaking in Minnesota, not so much. But
not so much. That's not so much is perhaps the understatement of this moment.
It might be at some point, knock on wood, this this too shall pass. How do you continue to engage this community that you've built around the state, around the region, around the country, as people are starting to go back to less virtual and more in-person things?
That is a great question that I don't have a perfect answer for yet. I will like freely admit that. I think that a lot of responding to COVID and responding to this moment, even more broadly than just specifically COVID, is kind of looking at where we are and using the circumstances of the moment and of the time to figure out, like, are we approaching things the right way? Are we, really leaning into this being a learning opportunity? Are we meeting the needs of the community? Has the pandemic created space for us to consider how we execute our mission in a different way? So, I mean, we are talking about no firm decisions made, of course, but like we're considering whether or not having afternoon school be remote is something that we should be doing post-pandemic as well. It's not that we're abundantly aware of the social benefits that come with being in person together, and there's no question of that. But you asked me about like what's different from when I was a student versus now. So when I was a student, all of the school districts ended school at roughly the same time. We had busing from the area district public schools that brought students to our building and whatnot, and they could do that because all the schools ended at the same time. Well, all the schools don't end at the same time anymore. There's a much greater degree of demands on sort of outside school time for students of every age, and like I will tell you, we have parents who have told us that live out in the western suburbs that have told us, like, we're so happy to be at the Talmud Torah of St. Paul, and we would not be there if it was in person because we couldn't get our students there. Like, we couldn't.
Yeah, that's, I mean, I live in Plymouth. That's not an easy drive at 3:30, 4 o'clock to make.
Our director of education, Heidi, she lives in Golden Valley, and she commutes to and from Golden Valley to Highland Park every day. But I will say this, I mean, we have to to talk about just sort of like the nature of commuting around our communities here, like we do have a family in our day school that's joining us who lives in Burnsville, and they drive to Highland Park from Burnsville for day school every day. And we're happy to have them here, and I'm so glad that that they're here.
Yeah. Yeah, for the day school versus after school programming, I think it's it's a different prospect of the driving
Yeah. The
the driving for a school day versus driving for an hour or two after school.
For sure.
It's not an apples to apples comparison.
Oh, there's no question. It's not an apples to apples comparison. But because it's not an apples to apples comparison, that's the stuff that we're considering about how, since you initially asked me, like, well, how do you look at shifting out of COVID?
Mm-hmm.
And the answer to that is really different depending on which of our programs we're talking about. Because, of course, shifting out of COVID for the day school looks different from shifting out of COVID for a supplementary program that is incredibly important, but that we've also made the decision that we're going to do remotely this whole year, mostly for ease of scheduling and planning on the part of our families and our teachers.
Pivoting to, as you grow into this position you're in now, are you still sort of in the learning what's going on sort of phase, or are you sort of envisioning big picture things for down the road?
I'd say a little of column A and a little of column B.
Okay.
The way I describe this job is it's a little bit like pushing many tiny boulders up many tiny hills all the time, hopefully with a better ending than what happened to Sisyphus, and also like just seeing whether anything is a little bit on fire and putting out those fires all at the same time as well.
Yeah.
I think that the metaphor that gets used a lot is that we have to be able to build the plane while we're flying it at the same time. And so I would say that there's some things that I'm still on the learning front about, and then there's some things that are all about visioning for the future, and it would be really nice if we could separate those out to not happening simultaneously, but that's just not the world that we live in.
No, it's not.
Yeah.
No, it's not. So what does I know we had hoped to originally talk well before we actually are.
Yes.
Part of the delay was sort of planning what the I guess 22-23
Yes.
school year, which is absurd to be talking about, but what that school year is going to be looking like. Not absurd because, I mean, obviously you guys have to talk about it. Absurd because that just seems so far away.
Don't worry, I'm in a school every day, and that even feels far away to me, even though I talk about the 2022-23 school year on a daily basis.
Right.
Yeah. It does feel very far away because I suppose date-wise it is relatively far away from this moment. It would have been even farther from when we were originally supposed to talk.
That's true, it would. But what is, in terms of where things sit right now in the planning standpoint, what is this upcoming year going to be looking like in terms of program?
Yeah, so that's a little different depending on which program you're talking about. So our adult ed program, Hineni, doesn't really function on a school year schedule because when you're talking about adult learning, some adults have school years like me. But generally speaking, most adults aren't working on like an academic calendar anymore. So that doesn't really function in the same way. But for the Newman School, our day school, we are going to be grades kindergarten through 5th grade in the fall, which is what we are this year. And we're looking forward to welcoming people, into the Newman School we'll be starting, just before Labor Day next year. And then inevitably dealing with the chaos of the fall holidays, as always happens.
Of course.
And then we actually haven't made a decision yet about. We will, of course, have afternoon school in Midrashah next year, but we haven't made a decision about whether or not it's going to be remote or in person or some mixture of the two or something else that we haven't even thought of yet.
Okay. So the 5th grade for the Newman School, this year with 5th grade is the first time least in a while, you've
Yeah.
had a fifth grade, because it had previously been K through 4, right?
Yep. So, and that's, I mean, it had been K through 4, and before that it was K through 3, and essentially we were aging up we were increasing in grades as we had students that were aging into those grades.
Okay.
Um, and we did actually entertain whether or not we were going to expand to 6th grade this year, but we chose not to be student centered, frankly, more than anything else.
Okay.
So the St. Paul Public Schools and Minneapolis Public Schools and the district that is Mendota, West St. Paul, and Egan.
Yeah,
They
and Inver Grove Heights
Yeah,
too,
in Inver Grove
I
Heights.
think.
I learned recently that Egan is in like 3 different school districts depending on which part of Egan you live in.
That
So
I used to cover Burnsville and Egan
you
in
know
District
then.
181. Oh yes, I
Yeah.
am well familiar with the mess that is. And I misspoke. Inver Grove is not part of it's. You're right. It's West St. Paul South. No, West St. Paul.
What I'll say is Minneapolis,
Mendo-
St. Paul, and District 197, which I know
Thank
is
you.
West
Just
St. Paul, a
that
chunk of Egan, and Mendota
and
and Mendota
Mendota
Heights.
Heights. Yes, yes.
So they all start largely. They all start, middle school at 6th grade,
Mhm.
and for contrasting examples from 20 years ago, previously most places started like junior high at 7th grade,
7th grade,
and
right?
so the shift over time has gone to 6th grade, and in some cases they even start at 5th grade. And so we looked at whether or not we should expand out to 6th grade, and said, and the very first question is like, is this the right thing for our students?
Mhm.
And the truth is that that's a really hard age, no matter where you are and what you're doing. And so, well, I'm confident that we would be able to offer, an education second to none if we were doing 6th grade. We are not, because we sort of looked around and said, well, these students are going to have to transition into a public school at some point, and this is the most natural inflection point. And we wanted to make sure that we were centering our students' best interest in that decision. And so that's
Okay.
the deal with that.
Which makes sense. I mean,
Right.
if your families and their kids aren't looking for it.
I mean, it's funny. We polled our 5th grade families and said, if
Yeah.
we offered 6th grade, would you be interested? And some said yes, and some said yes, but they want to know about the kinds of things that we were also concerned with. A being able to have a really robust offering of like co-curricular activities,
Mhm.
field trips, things like that. And we were concerned with all of the same stuff. And the other thing is like, I I look back and think about what my life was like from like 6th, 7th, and 8th grade, and my family life was a little bit chaotic at that time, so that certainly colors it as well. But that's not exactly an easy age, and so one of our 5th grade, current 5th grade families who told us that they were asking about 6th grade, they said like, truth is, we know that's a really hard time. That's a really hard age. And so our biggest concern would be if we stayed for 6th grade, like our kid would have to transition into 7th grade eventually anyway. And at that point, um, all of their friend groups would have already been made because of starting in 6th grade
Mhm.
together. And so we we are on the same page with our families of wanting to make sure that we're centering the best interest of our students.
And as I went to day school growing up in Michigan, and uh, after 5th grade was the time where
Yeah.
people were either going to see it all the way through to 8th grade, or the start of middle school was when they chose the public school route. And I think for exactly that same reason. So it's interesting that 30 plus years for me later, it's still the same. It's the same considerations that are being made.
Right. I mean, and it was the same consideration that was made 20 years ago when I was a student. I mean, my parents knew that I was going to be going to public school for high school, and they looked at me in 6th grade and said, "Do you want to go to the middle school, or do you want to go to?" So I went to Highland for senior high. I would have been
Mhm.
Highland for junior high if I'd
Sure.
gone to public school. And they said, "Do you want to go to Highland for 7th grade?" And at that time I wasn't ready. This was the only educational environment I'd been in for, all of my years of formative schooling. And so I did middle school here and got, an incredibly robust education. And actually, that was where I had the opportunity to have Yessie Gordon as my teacher, which is, if nothing else, is a pretty incredible thing to get.
Yeah. That
Um,
is very cool. He is tremendous. Every time I've talked to him, I've enjoyed it.
yeah,
He's great.
Yessie is a force.
Yeah, it's as good a definition as you could probably come up with for him.
Yeah, and so but I mean, he has been affiliated with the Talmud Torah of St. Paul in one way or another for 40 plus years, and we are, when we think about and talk about like the nature of Jewish educators and Jewish teachers and all of that. I mean, it's Yossi is like the pinnacle of who we're talking about, and I find it incredibly gratifying to get the opportunity to look at the experience that I had and say, yes, we're able to continue offering that to a future generation of students.
Well, they're lucky. The future generation are lucky to learn from him
That's
because he's terrific.
I agree.
Well, Sho Garland, I have thoroughly enjoyed getting to meet you and to talk to you, but I have final two questions for you
I'm
before I let
ready.
you go. What is your favorite Jewish holiday?
Oh, it's so funny. I was listening to Who the Folk yesterday with your interview with Daniel Goldschmidt, who I went to Herzl Camp with.
Oh, excellent.
Um, and and I heard Daniel say that Shabbat was I actually don't know Daniel's pronouns at the moment. So I heard Shabbat come up as a favorite holiday there, and I thought about it, and I guess I have like two answers. I will say that in general, my favorite holiday is Passover, is Pesach, because it's the so I've lived, well, now I live locally again, but for 8 years I lived away from my parents and my immediate family, and my brother still lives out east, and so Passover is uh, the time when our family is able to get together and lean into sort of all the best traditions that make us whole and make us Jews and whatnot. And I love being able to sit around the table and reminisce and talk about what finding the Afikoman was like 15 years ago and 20 years ago. And I mean, for when I was a child, we, as I'm sure is true for lots of people, you go to the same seders every year.
Hmm.
And so one thing that I'm really blessed with is that like the people whose houses I used to go to when I was a kid, and was friends with their friends. Now, as adults, we're still friends because that's the nature of Jewish community, and so we get to
Right.
spend Pesach together still, which is incredible, and I love it. I would say but like Shabbat does hold a really sort of like wonderful special place in my heart. I think the for two reasons. One is that when until starting this job, I don't really think I fully appreciated the value of being like told you need to stop working for a 24-hour period of time. The truth is about this job, like I could work every hour of every day, and if I didn't have to sleep, like there would still be more things to do.
Yeah.
That's the nature of running a big organization. And so I really appreciate Shabbat, I think, more now than I ever have before. Um, and the other thing about Shabbat for me is, so I was a Herzl camper for many many summers. Truth be told, I'm actually wearing a Herzl camp T-shirt today. You just can't see it. Um, I'll show you on the video before we sign off. But Shabbat at camp is this incredibly special, magical experience,
Yep.
and I miss it, and I love it, and I think that that's between that and now that's sort of like the thing that instilled sort of like really deep, beautiful love and those kinds of ritual observances for me.
Oh, that's very cool. And what is your favorite Jewish food?
Oh, you have to pick, um,
I
and
I
then
really try to put you on the spot.
yeah,
Yes.
and then do we have an argument about the best preparation of that food? Because like that's a whole different
Well,
conversation.
but it depends on the food. Sometimes
Sure,
there is only one proper
there's
preparation of it.
you haven't heard about the two Jews and three opinions, Lonnie?
Oh, try I in the media I live it, trust me.
I'm sure. Um, so favorite Jewish food. Oh, I'd say it's got to be charoset. Honestly, I think
Okay.
it's got to be charoset because there's And because I'm the person who makes the charoset in our family, and it will get made it will get made for the Seder, but then it will get made and put in like Rubbermaid containers to just eat
Yeah.
throughout the week. And the weird thing is I never think to make it outside of Pesach. I feel like that would somehow cheapen it and make it less special.
I couldn't agree more.
But my family is Ashkenazi all the way down, and so the charoset that I grew up making is very how just we're gonna throw in the food processor the red apples and the manischewitz and the walnuts and the cinnamon, and you're just gonna spin it around until it tastes right.
Yep.
But I will say one year we because more and more companies have started making not just hechsher and kosher hechsher, but Pesach hechsher possible. One year we started experimenting with different charosets, and I made a tequila charoset with green apples, and like it was pretty good.
Whoa.
So I'm not against changing things for the sake of trying new stuff.
I'll at least mix, because I generally like the Red Delicious those are terrible apples, but like I'll do sort of a mix of green and Honeycrisp for the charosets.
Sure. Yeah.
To mix up get different textures, different flavors out of the apple. Tequila in lieu of the manischewitz. That's interesting.
Well, it does help that my wife likes tequila, and so she was like, "We're gonna lean in. We're gonna try it." I think we may have thrown in. I think it was the first year we could find kosher Pesach tequila, and so we decided, all right, we're gonna like lean in and try a really weird thing, and it wasn't perfect, but like it wasn't terrible either.
All right.
You know. Otherwise, I feel like the honorable mention of Jewish foods always goes to challah. Because it's the best,
obviously.
And I'll tell you, one of the great privileges of working in a school is that most Fridays our hallways smell really good because we bake challah, and it's
privilege and danger.
You are correct about both of those things. Privilege and danger in perhaps equal measure.
Absolutely. Well, Sho Garland, it was great to talk to you. Thank you so much for coming on, and best of luck as you settle in at your alma mater of Talmud Torah of St. Paul.
Thank you. It's wonderful to speak with you, Lonnie.
The Who the Folk podcast is part of the Jew Folk Podcast Network, a product of Jew Folk Inc. Please subscribe, rate, and review the show wherever you get your podcasts. If you have suggestions for other podcast guests, please email them to me at editor@tcjewfolk.com. For our other shows, check out tcjewfolk.com/podcast.